as you can see, I'm going to move this over here, that my brush is here. It's a circular brush. It's a hard edge circular brush, and you can tell by clicking over here. And you see that it's actually a large brush because I've got a large document. Again, 11 inches by 11 inches at 300 pixels per inch. So it's a high resolution document so far. And the hardness value is set to 100%. Now, I do not want to click on the background layer, okay? In order to show you this layer style stuff, we have to do this on a new layer. So I'm doing this on layer 1. And let's go pick a color here. How about something fun, a little bit of maybe a lighter blue. That's pretty cool. Click OK. And really all we want to do here is just make some marks. Nothing spectacular. Okay. And then down here, this is where your layer styles are. Now we're going to start off with the easy one. And I'm not going to go through all of these. Some of these, especially inner glow, inner shadow, are pretty much the same thing as outer shadow and outer glow. And but some of the other ones are pretty cool. So anyway, let's start off with the easiest one to get, and that is the drop shadow. Now I'm going to move this over here so you can see what's going to happen. Now this document is so large that you really can't see how far the shadow is, but all we're going to do, as long as this window is open, I can click over in my canvas area and click and drag, and look what happens. I can move the shadow around. Okay. Pretty neat, right? And it's moving two of the factors over there, which is the angle dial and the distance. Now the angle has to do with where the light source is coming from. So you can see that if I'm putting my shadow, let's say down around 6 o'clock, okay, you can see the light source is actually up high at noon. Okay, if I set this to 4 or 5 o'clock, then it's over here about 10 or 11 o'clock. Okay, so it works in opposites, right? Now we've been using angle and distance. I typically use size as well. Size will make the shadow soft. So I'll crank this up a little bit, and look what happens. The shadow gets softer. We use the opacity to set the density. So let's say we want this shadow to be a little less dense. We'll crank this down, and it's a much more subtle shadow. If we crank this all the way, obviously, it gets very black. Still, it's soft, but it's still very black. And you can change the color of your shadow. If you want a red shadow, for instance, you can do that. It looks terrible, but you know, whatever. And you can use blend modes. Quite honestly, I don't use blend modes too much. By default, it starts you off in multiply mode, but that's really neither here nor there. The spread, I really don't play with too much because it just makes your shadow bigger. And it winds up making the shadow look rather, it kind of negates the whole point of using the size slider. And remember, size really means softness. I think, again, poorly labeled by Adobe. Now I'm going to click OK here for a minute. And notice what happens over here. We now have a list of effects that are applied to this layer, and there is the effect right there. I can turn off drop shadow individually, or I can turn off the entire list. Now, of course, at this point, the entire list consists of just one thing, so it's only one thing being turned off. But I'm sure you can probably guess that we can add many more list items there to do all at once. Now, the reason I brought you out here to show you this stuff, of course, but if I go back to my brush tool, I can continue to paint. And look what happens. The drop shadow also shows up, okay? So the way these layer styles work, by the way, it says FX down there, but these things are really called layer styles because they're attached to the layer, okay? But anyway, the way layer styles work is that they're based on visible pixels, okay? Now I'm going to turn this off for a minute. And now, actually, I don't believe layer styles will work if I click on the background layer. In fact, it just gets dimmed out, okay? But let's say that I just change the name of this, and we'll call it layer 0, okay? And now, technically, I could apply a drop shadow here, but there's a problem, okay? The shadow is supposed to be outside my shape. Now, my entire shape is this layer. It's all white. So, feasibly speaking, the shadow, I'll click over here like this. The shadow's there, we just can't see it. So what we've got to do is use the move tool, for instance, and we'll click and drag this. Now you can see I've moved the pixels, I moved all the layer, and you can see that it does have a drop shadow there. Okay, most of the other effects work in a similar fashion. Outer glow, obviously. Now, pattern overlay, you could apply it to that layer. Gradient overlay, you can. Color overlay, satin. Another glow, yes. Inner shadow, yes. Stroke, not so much. And bevel and emboss, not so much either. My rule of thumb is just make a new layer out of what you want to have an effect on it. It makes your life easy. Okay, I'm going to hit Command Z. Oops, Command Option Z. Got to close this first. There we go. I put it back, and I've removed that, and I'll even go back one step further to make it a background. Okay, so that's drop shadow. Now, of course, now we could just add a new effect just by going here, like to go to, I like pattern overlay. And look what happens here. By default, a new thing shows up, and it actually overrides the original color. Okay, you can see this pattern here. It's overriding the original blue that I painted on there. Okay, it's not the worst thing in the world, but let's look at some of these things. We could make this more transparent by reducing the opacity, and look what happens. That whole thing becomes more transparent, and we see the original blue, which is kind of fun. Now we could get around that also by trying a blend mode. So we could try multiply. I believe color burn works pretty well. And you can try all kinds of these blend modes and see some cool stuff. Did we look at scale? So we could scale up that particular pattern. That's lots of fun. But I will tell you, I'm not a big fan. By the way, I'm going to go back to normal. I'm not a big fan of this particular pattern. Let's click and open this right over here. And you can see that we have other patterns. Now this is just a sample, and by the way, this is where we start talking about libraries again. So we could try the tie-dye. We could try the carpet-looking texture. We might even want to scale that down a little bit. Okay, that's a little bit too much. There we go. The next one is kind of a, it looks to me like a fake leather kind of a texture. And then we've got this. What is this called? This is called, it's called, it doesn't show me the thing. This is called gray granite. A little hard to see, but not bad. Now, this is really just a sample library of other libraries. So we have to go out of here. See this little gear looking thing? Okay, we've got all kinds of libraries that we can play with that come with Photoshop. And I like going down to these guys here, the texture fills. So we can try a few of these things. And we get asked the typical question, replace the current patterns with the patterns from texture fill. Now if we click OK, this library gets swapped out. Please tell me I didn't say library. This library gets swapped out for the new library. But if I click append, that will just add the new library to the old library. So I'm just going to swap this out. There we go. There's our new set of textures. And we can click through these. We've got some cool clouds. I don't know what that is. Oh, it's amoeba bark. Blistered paint, that's one of my favorites. Burlap, in case you have any burlap sacks lying around, you know what that looks like. Canvas, and so forth. So just put your cursor over them and you can get a good idea. Frosted glass. And of course, there are many other kinds of libraries. Now, FYI, if you dig these libraries, I'll append this time. If you like these libraries and you'd like to find more, just go search around on the internet. You can find all kinds of things. And they're on places like DeviantArt. They're on many, I believe, Photoshop tutorial type websites. You can find that kind of stuff. So these are fun textures. And you can swap them out to libraries at all times. So that's pattern overlay. I want to continue on with this, do a couple more of these things. Now there's gradient overlay. Now gradient overlay kind of, it writes over, how do I want to say this? It overrides the pattern overlay. Okay, in order to test out this gradient overlay, we've got to go back to gradient overlay. And we can Try multiply, and look what happens. The gradient is there, and so is the pattern. We can maybe try some other things. Again, color burn kind of changes the contrast a bit. And I believe lighten, overlay. So you get some mild differences going on there, which is nice. Okay, let's talk about this gradient business. Now, there are several gradients that are already built in, starting actually at the black and white one. Now we can change color. And that's fun. These two probably aren't as obvious. Look at that, foreground to background. So that's your foreground to background color chips. If I move this window, those are my foreground and background color chips. Or foreground to transparent. That can work too. So let's take a look at this. Now this, and by the way, these gradient overlay tools work the same as this tool right over here. This is your gradient tool. However, this is acting as a layer style. And remember how we talked about working non-destructively? So working with layer styles is working very non-destructively. If we were to use the tool itself, I'll show you the tool in a little bit. The tool itself would actually start to maybe write over other layer pixels. So not crazy about that. I tend to like this tool quite a bit. Anyway, so if you want to change and create your own gradient, well, here's an example here. Sorry, readjusting here. So let's say we go to this blue one, the blue-orange. I'm sorry, it's not blue. It's more of a violet-orange. So we've got a color stop here that is in the orange range. We've got a color stop over here that is in the dark violet range. If you'd like to create some more stops, you just click there, boom. And so it takes the value that's there and kind of spreads it out. You can move these around. And let's actually move this around so we can actually see what's happening on the screen. Ooh, they moved together. I didn't know that. Okay, so let's make a more obnoxious color that will pop out clearly. How about something along the red lines? It's a little bit more clear. So you can see the orange up here into the red, down into the violet and the deep violet. Okay, so we can change how that scales. So we've got much more orange. Now it comes in, it's got a very tight gradient down here. You can put in many more stops along the way and change colors. Right now they're all showing up as kind of a red, but we can change that around. Let's try maybe a yellow. So you get the hang of that, right? If you want to get rid of any of these things, you just click and drag, and it goes away. That's pretty cool. The tags up here, they're the stops. This is a little counterintuitive when we talk about all the masking we've been doing, layer mask and such. Usually, like on a layer mask, white means visible. Well, here, black means visible. Okay, so let's say that I put another stop up here, like we'll put it over here. And look what happens. It actually makes the gradient transparent. Okay, if I want to make this visible again, I crank up the opacity back to 100% or 0, and now it's transparent. And it affects these other stops as well down here. And we could just drag this over here for where the transparency is going to be. And if you were really thrilled with this, you could save this and call this a new gradient. We'll call this Scott's gradient and save it. And I believe that's it right there. Or is it? I always get confused on this. New? Okay, there it is. So if I click new, it actually puts the gradient chip in there. So there you go. The last thing you want to play with here, well, you can change the angle of the gradient. I really, actually, I'm not very happy with that gradient. I like this one quite a bit. So let's say, now it's a little hard to see maybe on this texture. So let's go back to normal so you can see what the gradient looks like. So the gradient is actually using that angle dial that we were using for drop shadow and such. So we can change the angle of the gradient and where the light and dark values are going. We could make this, and currently this is linear, but we could make this perhaps a radial gradient. So now the dark is in the center and the lighter orange is on the outside. We could flip that and reverse it so that orange is in the center. I would recommend that you do try angle, reflected, and diamond. Personally, probably 99.9% of the gradients that I make use radial and linear. Okay, and if you scale things up or down, in this case, it makes the orange side a little bit smaller, or we could make it really huge. Now's a good time to stop. Okay, we're going to continue on here and try some other effects here. Now we've got a list here. Let's turn off the effects. That's the original. And that's just with 3 effects going on here. And I just want to show you maybe 1 or 2 more. Let's see, we've done drop shadow. There's a warning about the glows. Now there's outer glow here and there's inner glow. Basically they work the same way, just that one is outside the shape and one is in. Now unfortunately the setup that they start you off with when you give you a glow is they start you off in screen mode. You can't even see the glow there. You might be able to see a little bit of an outline. It's not much. Let's set this for normal. And let's also crank it up. Let's there, now you can see the glow. Now obviously that may be too much of a glow for you. You want something maybe a little bit more subtle, but you can now actually see it. So just be aware that the settings for the glows, when they start off, they just stink. Okay. Let's see, we've got outer glow, inner glow works the same way. Color overlay. Now color overlay is not working on the glow, but it is working on everything else. And all it does is it takes whatever visible pixel you had on the layer and it just fills it with a color, just a solid color. And then of course you can use blend modes and whatnot to see through it and so forth. That's kind of fun. But really it's just a solid color. Now satin, I really don't want to show satin because I've never really got it to work. It looks weird. There's a better way of showing you how satin works. Inner glow, inner shadow, they're just variations on the other things we've looked at. Stroke is just an outside. You can kind of see an outside thing there. Let's make this more visible. So we'll crank up the size. And it just puts a stroke around the edge. Just a big black thing there. Obviously you can change the color to something else. Anyway. And the last thing here is bevel and emboss. Now I'm going to turn off pretty much everything else here just for a minute so you can see how this works. Now bevel and emboss. Now it looks like it's a bit of a drop shadow here, but it's really more. And I'm going to change the depth and watch what happens. And change the size as well. Now we may have a bit of difficulty. There it goes. It took a while. I was going to say we might have some difficulty because this file is actually rather large to start with, so it took a while for it to process. Now it kind of makes it look like it's dimensional, and that's what bevel and emboss speak. It's creating a bevel, a beveled edge. There are several bevels here. There's an inner bevel, outer bevel, emboss, pillow emboss, etc. I do recommend that you play with these things and find out what they do. Chisel hard. You can kind of see kind of a chiseled edge around there. Chisel soft. Actually looks worse. Looks more chiseled. We can soften a lot of that stuff out. There we go. So it smooths those edges out a bit more. Now the shading has to do with where the light source is. If you look at this stuff, here's the light source, and that's the way it looks over here. It's creating a shadow on this side. So if you want to change the angle, you can move that dial around. It acts a lot like a drop shadow. And then you've got a highlight mode, which is this side now, and you've got this color for that. You've got a black shadow mode. You could change the colors there and change how the blend modes work there as well and how much opacity is applied to each one of those things. Please do play with that. Try even contour. I really don't see much of a difference in contour, but you might see a difference. It kind of changes how these shapes, the edge looks. And you can apply a texture. So there's an applied texture. Now, oh, that looks like a cookie. All of a sudden I'm hungry. Okay. So I'm going to cancel all this and go back to our earlier version, to what we had over here. And the last thing I want to, and I admitted this in class, I admit this frequently, when these layer styles came along in, I believe, version 4 of Photoshop, it kind of freaked me out. It was like you look at all those controls. You know, it's like, what do all these sliders do? It's especially like this one. That's just frightening, all the different sliders and stuff. At first, you get the hang of them eventually, but it frightened me for sure. So for the first couple of versions, I didn't play with these layer styles at all. What I did was I waited, and then they came up with this stuff, the styles panel. Now this is pretty cool. Now again, this is a library, and there's other libraries that we'll play with in a moment. But what this does is like I'm going to click on this guy over here. This is called Color Target. And what it does is it takes out all those layer styles that I had before, and it plugs in new layer styles. So what these styles are is they're kind of like pre-canned, pre-packaged styles that have kind of a good chance of being successful. Now that's called Color Target. If we go to the third one there, this is Striped Cone. The next one is kind of a glass button look. And then there's Blanket. There's a spattered paint kind of a thing. I love that one. This is kind of a chromed satin. Tie-dyed silk there. Excuse me. And there's all kinds of things that you can plug in there. Now the way my procedure typically works is I will find a texture that works for me. It's like I kind of like that texture that's built in there. I'm not crazy about the gradients that are going on. So look what happened. I've got two things going on there now. There's a bevel. You can see what that does. That's back on. So that's the bevel, and the bevel and emboss actually contains the texture. And I like the texture. I just don't like the colors. So I'll go into gradient overlay. So I'll double click on that, and I'll get the controls there. And you can see that it's got this crazy fill going on there. But what if I want something really simple, like my favorite with the purple and orange, violet and orange colors here? Well, just click that, and now I've got violet and orange, and it kept the texture. If I still am not crazy about it, I might add another color here, and it might be that one, and I might push this more towards the other value. Maybe bring this in. There we go. So, as I said, my procedure is I find something that I can work with and then customize it and tweak it to fit my needs. Okay? Now, that's the basic procedure, but let's look at some of these other libraries, okay? So let's go to the pop-out here, and I'm going to go to one of my favorite ones, which is Textures. Do I want to replace the styles? Yes, I want to replace all of the styles. Boom. And look, we've got a whole new set of things. Some of them we've seen before, obviously this one. Oh, did you notice what happened there? Okay, I clicked on that blanket texture, and it wiped out any changes that I made. Okay, so whatever change I made to the violet and orange colors, what happened was it didn't affect this effect at all. This is a pre-canned, pre-packaged set of layer styles is what they are, and you really can't mess them up. Okay, now here's one of my favorite ones right next to it, the brick one. Love that one. Asphalt. I don't even know what that one is. Ancient Stone. Let's see, there's the tie-dye. Here's some oak. So chances are between all of these libraries and the stuff that you might find on the internet, there's a good chance that you can find something that will work for you or that you can tweak into position. Okay? So please do try these things. They're very fun. If you want to play with the brick thing. The brick thing actually has a texture. Look at that one. That actually has the brick texture right there. So if you want to scale that up or down, you can do that. There's actually two areas in this particular style that have textures. There's a pattern overlay here as well. So you would probably have to scale those things at the same rate to get them to work properly. But anyway, if I click back on this guy here, there we go. And still, I can turn that list off and my paint daubs are still there. If I want to paint some more, I can paint that stuff in, turn on my effects, and you can see it applied. It's pretty cool.